Jen, are you a writer?
I am not. I am an author. It's interesting because people ask me all the time and it catches me off guard. And I have to remember that, yes, I've written 3 books. I am an author, so I am a writer. In that sense, I am not a screenwriter.
So what is it that you do aside from the books?
I'm a speaker. I am a blogger for the Huffington Post. I am a writing instructor for Writers on the Verge at NBC. I've been a writing instructor there for 8 years. And I'm a story career consultant at Jen Grisanti Consultancy.
When someone approaches you through your website,
Yes.
and they say, I'm considering hiring you, how can you determine the difference between a writer that's dabbling in the industry versus those who say, this is my chosen career path, and you can tell the difference in terms of their level of commitment?
Yes. It's interesting. I mean, I get writers from coming out of college to co-executive producer, staff writer, all the way up to co-executive producer level. This is because I was a former 12-year studio executive. And when I was an executive, I staffed over 15 top primetime TV shows. And I got to know a lot of writers. So that allowed me, whereas I know a lot of consultants get the brand new writers. But because I've been exposed to the professional writer, I do get a lot of professional writers. I think my feeling is like a part of being a current programming executive really was identifying new voices. So I like working with the green writer who hasn't developed bad habits and who is open to the process. So I really don't have a problem if I have someone who is dabbling versus totally committed, as long as they are committed to the process that they sign on for.
You said something that caught my ear, and that was bad habits.
Yes.
So in terms of being an established writer or someone who's done it for several years and has, quote, their way, what are some different tip-offs where you see, okay, this person's more closed, sort of, arms and not open to the process?
Oh yeah, there are many tip-offs. I would say probably the biggest tip-off is the inability to hear a note before defending a note. So I think like the biggest tip-offs, the first tip-off is on the page. When you can tell in the first 3 pages if a writer knows how to write, really has. But what I can say is you can also tell a voice, and you can have a writer who has a voice but doesn't have the formatting down. But the voice can still be heard through the bad formatting. So that's why I say I'm open, and I have no problem working with brand new writers. I love that. I also love working with produced writers who do have a stronger sense of the craft. However, the gift is really in recognizing when you have the newer writer who makes faux pas like defending a note before hearing a note, which is a very big mistake that many newer writers make. It also is a mistake that writers make on staff. And so it really is helping them to feel safe so that when you're giving a note, and I can say when I was a studio executive, the agenda was that of the network in the studio that I was carrying and giving notes. Whereas as a story career consultant independently, I have no agenda other than making the story the best that it could be. So this is why I encourage writers to be open and to recognize my only goal is to make their story the best that it can be.
You said something earlier about you can overlook maybe formatting if the voice is strong and authentic, does that mean if the story is original, or it has nothing to do with that?
No, it does. You know, voice comes down to so many different things. And a voice could come down to a character description. It could come down to writing poetic and lyrical action lines. It could come down to the original concept. It could come down to knowing how to write a flawed character well. I mean, there are so many. I always try to figure out if I could really pinpoint what voice is and help people understand. And I think for me, a large way that I explain voice is the idea of what is your world view, what has happened to you in your life that has caused you pain and given you something to say. And how does your writing reflect that?
Oh, that's great. Have you ever seen someone be too emotional and too, because we all feel that our story is intense, and it is because we've lived it, but have you ever seen it in the writing where it maybe toned down whatever it is, the anger in that scene?
Oh, yeah.
Something.
I mean, I would say a much greater problem is not enough emotion. I think the too much emotion is not near as common as the how do we elevate the emotion so that we feel this more.
And when you see that, do you feel like that person's phoning in that character? It's like a filler, or is it that maybe they're not totally in touch?
Oh, I think that comes from being green and not really understanding. I think there's so much that goes into strong character work. I work with writers on the idea of thinking about the wound, thinking about the childhood wound, and how in a TV pilot, how the series trigger splits open that wound. And then the idea of what is the negative narrative that has come from that wound, and how is that getting in the way of the central character achieving the goal? And then how, through the pursuit, is the central character one step toward healing that wound?
Jen, can you give us an example of this core wound and how it might translate into maybe a current show that's on now?
Of course. Actually, I just watched two series that I love, The Night Manager and Happy Valley, but I'll go into The Night Manager. And what was interesting about both shows is the wound that happens in episode 1 that clearly triggered an old wound is something that's revisited in the finale. So we see the powerful wound in the opening show of both series. And then in the finale, we see the character have an opportunity because the same wound could happen all over again. And seeing the reaction is really what adds depth to the character. So in The Night Manager, we get a sense that there's a wound that they don't explore in detail, the past wound, and that has to do with when he was in the military. And then the present wound, and I don't want to give away anything that happens in the pilot because it's so powerful, but there's a very powerful wound that happens due to a choice that he makes. And that wound, creates a narrative that has to do with the idea of love versus the mission, and really understanding the choices that are made and how they affect an outcome. And he is definitely led by love. And the flaw is that could get in the way with what he needs to do professionally. And that, again, like links back to the idea of the wound. And I've called it other things as well. Like a lot of people say people don't get the wound. And I say, okay, well, another way to think about it is the series trigger happens to the central character, pushing them into a powerful dilemma that leaves a void. And how does the pursuit fill the void?
Interesting. I know you've said that in order to be a strong storyteller, you have to be living and present in your own story. And I think most people would say, if they write something, that, oh yes, this is it, it's right here. But when you've gone back and read something and given someone notes, have you seen, you know what, I don't know if they really are present?
Oh, definitely. I think that, you know, my feeling is the best way to tell a strong story is to be present when your own is happening. And I think that so many of us, when our all is lost moments happen, distract ourselves with work, with working out, with partying, with anything that will take away the pain. And I think a large part of the emotional work that I do with writers is really helping them be present during their pain. Because I often find that when someone is raw in the middle of the all is lost moment, like they just lost their mom or dad, or their sibling, you know, committed suicide. I've had clients that have had to deal with that. And there's a really raw emotional response to it. And what, understandably so. And what I say is you have to understand yourself, because very often you have to do the work to heal the wound before you're ready to explore it in your writing. Or many writers are immediately ready and therapeutically need to go to the page to make sense of it. So I always think that when our darkest moments happen, that it is the greatest time to express ourselves.
I understand you are a Joseph Campbell fan. You like him. So I found this quote, and I think this is one of his more popular quotes. We must be willing to get rid of the life we've planned so it is to have the life we're waiting for us, something to that effect.
Yes.
How is this true in your life?
I love that quote. I'm a huge Joseph Campbell fan. Like, I think I am in awe of his, the way he used words and the way he experienced life with such a raw sense of understanding light and darkness. And so in my own life, I would say that the quote has to do with the present as well. Like, I think, say for example, when I wanted to be a vice president of current programming, that was a 13-year journey for me, from the assistant level to the vice president level. And I think in my mind, and this is something I work with writers on, is I was so attached to the destination that at times I didn't value the journey in the way that I could have. And I think that, when we do attach to what the future is supposed to be, then we're taking ourselves out of the present and we're attaching to something and we're not being in something. And I honestly think the greatest part of the writer's journey is learning to be in the journey versus attached to the destination.
So keeping with the idea of getting rid of the life we've planned, we're in LA, and so many people, myself included, we all come here from somewhere else,
right,
with an idea of a destination.
Yes.
And I think you'd said this before, people under 30 definitely have an idea of how things look on the outside is very important.
Yes.
And probably in LA, it could be beyond 30 too, but
yeah.
When you speak to writers that are maybe under 30. I don't know how many of them are actually approaching you to look at their work, but how do you sort of guide them through that? I don't know, maybe that's not what you do, but because...
No, it is what I do.
Okay.
I mean, I've had so many writers say you should be a therapist. And I'm definitely of the belief that if there were anything else I would do in this world, it would be that. And I think that because emotional response to life fascinates me. And definitely going with that. Okay, so going with the idea of I can start a consult with a new writer who is like, all right, Jen, I want to write this pilot, I want to sell this pilot, and I want to be a working writer by next year. Now, depending on what the journey has been so far, if this is a brand new writer that has that aspiration, then it will take me looking at the writing and understanding where they are in the process. Oddly enough, I have had writers that are newer writers where they express that aspiration, and I think it could be a reality if the right actions are taken to lead to that outcome. Whereas I can work with the writer who says, Jen, I want to be in your top 5% and I want to be working by next year. Whereas that is not a realistic expectation. And so I think it really is, I think what people have to understand more than anything, and again, it goes into the quote, and I probably went outside of the quote with the example I gave, but let's say within what I talked about, my pursuit was to run a studio. That's what I thought I was being groomed for. That's the destination that I thought I was moving toward, and my journey got interrupted. It got interrupted when my contract wasn't picked up after 15 years with 2 sister companies. So, and it was on the heels of a situation that came out of nowhere. So it was like I had 5 shows coming back. I had never been warned about anything. And then in a moment, due to a choice that I made, 15 years were gone. And I was no longer going in the direction that I thought was my destination. And that caused me to have to redefine. And many writers, I will tell this as well. I mean, you know, certainly being the writing instructor for Writers on the Verge at NBC, we have to tell the 8 final writers that get chosen out of 2,000 that yes, you made it to this point, but there is no guarantee that you're going to be a working writer. What this step does is it gives you greater opportunity to give you the outcome that you desire. However, that is going to be up to you and the work that you put in to this opportunity. And so I think guiding writers to recognize that they may have to redefine what that destination is in order to really find joy in the writing process.
Well, that's excellent because it kind of leads into what I was going to ask next, and that is, have you seen a writer approach you, under 30, over 30, driven more by ego, and then they've kind of come back to you, or you've run into them several years later and you can tell that all of that, it's now they need to do this and it has nothing to do with a title, it's for them personally?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, when we look at character, we look at the internal aspect of the character and the external. And it's the same in life. When we look at the writer and we think the internal aspect, many stories, I say the first 3/4 of the story, the hero wants to achieve the goal for ego-related reasons. Then, through hitting obstacle after obstacle leading to the all is lost moment, they are humbled. And then there is a recognition that the achievement of the goal isn't just about them, it's about the greater good. And it's the same for the writer. The writer has to go through that in the life process. They have to go through, many writers, when they first take on the journey, they want to become a working feature writer or working TV writer because they want to validate themselves, because they want mom and dad to think that they are all that, because they, want to make bucket loads of money. And the desire is not aligned in a strong way because the ego is driving the outcome. And I think through the writing process and learning that there are going to be so many hard knocks along the way, then they move into the spirit and the real voice that needs to take place for the writing to be a success.
I think I heard Mary Tyler Moore do just a quick quote, and that was that no one gets out of this life without something.
Yes.
Which I thought was interesting because for me, I've seen there's kind of people that have had a lot of hardships in their childhood and then their adult life seems to be somewhat easier, and then the reverse.
Yes.
Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah. I think, this is what I've learned. Like, let's say in my own life, I took the two moments that define my voice are a long relationship that ended in a short marriage and represented the death of the fairy tale. And then losing a job after 15 years with two sister companies that in mid-pursuit. So both those moments defined my voice. And my voice is that of representing the underdog, the idea of overcoming falls and recognizing that we can push ourselves into a direction that was even more positive than before if we're open to the process. So I think that, through understanding how to move through that process, in understanding that a negative turn can turn you into the direction that you're supposed to be going, then again, I think that's where the voice comes alive, because you have something to say.
Keeping with the ego-driven writer versus one that's doing it more for their own healing or for the greater good, do you see maybe a younger writer, let's say under 30, who's gone through early childhood trauma, have maybe what they call an old soul?
Yes.
And more of an authentic voice versus someone who had an idyllic childhood but hasn't really had that sort of thing that's really going to change them happen yet?
Hasn't had the moment of loss, like the humbling life moment, the all is lost. I think I've had both writers. I know when I was staffing at the studio that what I found was writers would get so hung up on, should I get a master's degree? Should I, this, should I that? Should I have studied film? And I think what I came to find was that writers who went from undergrad to master's, and I actually have even had writers who got their MFA and then got their law degree, and then they go to the writer's room. And that's like they haven't experienced enough of life. That's like they've been in a schoolroom and they haven't really known the ups and downs versus a 30-year-old writer. I remember I recently had a writer who was under 30 who I said to her, what do you think your voice is? And she said, oh, I know what my voice is. I tend to write teen drama where there is an underdog element and it's moving through that, the stresses that are involved with that. And I said, all right, I like that. Do you know what your wound is, where that came from? And she's like, oh, I absolutely know my wound. And it was so, like, this was an old soul. Like, she had such clarity with where what she wants to say through story was coming from. And she said, my mom had many kids before she was ready, and two of my siblings had autism and Asperger's, and my mom wasn't ready to deal with that. So I became the parent. And so I felt emotionally abandoned by my mom. And I write stories where the central character's wound is emotional abandonment.
Wow.
So that for me was like, I was like, all right, you're a writer. Like, you understand how to process life and bring it to the page. And you understand at such an early age what you have to say.
Moving from the ego to the spirit, do we have an example of a television show or film right now?
Yes. So I have a movie that I actually mention in my book, Storyline, Finding Gold in Your Life Story. And it's the movie Up in the Air. So George Clooney's character at the beginning of the story, he's all ego. And it is the recognition that what we see in the beginning of the movie is his highfalutin single lifestyle that is a result of him being able to fire people through going to them. And then the inciting incident is when he is told, you are going to be grounded and you are going to now fire people on the computer. So the dilemma that puts him in is he's going to lose his highfalutin single lifestyle that is led by the belief that we see in his motivational speeches of go through life with an empty backpack and non-commitment and detachment. So this is a negative narrative that is leading him. And at the midpoint, when Natalie, I believe is the character's name, if I remember correctly, she's the one who got them grounded. So when he's along Natalie's side and he falls into the water with his biggest fear, which is the picture of his sister and her fiance, so commitment. So we have the symbolism of commitment. He falls into the water and she says to him, you put yourself in a cocoon of self-banishment. So this is when the character is starting to recognize that his philosophy is no longer serving him. And then we see him take an action and go to the house of his love interest, Alex, which he wouldn't normally have done, and he discovers that she's married with kids. And then we see him take another action, which is to tell his sister that he will walk her down the aisle. And she said, oh, we don't need you. We already have someone. So this is the point where the character is recognizing that the ego is no longer serving. And there is a recognition that now it's not just about achieving the goal of not getting grounded because of his own personal needs. There is a recognition because the woman jumps off the bridge in one of the situations that if people are fired on the computer, they won't have the personal rapport of having someone in person to create trust and security, and therefore more situations like that could happen. So he awakens to the idea that the achievement of the goal isn't just about him and his personal needs of wanting to keep a highfalutin single lifestyle. It is about the greater good.
I think you'd said before that being fired in Hollywood is a rite of passage, and it's not the end of the road. It's actually great. You're part of the club now.
Yes. I think, like when we think of ego, so when I wrote my book, Change Your Story, Change Your Life, it was all based on that life moment, on the unexpected life moment of my pursuit taking a turn and being interrupted mid-process. And I would say that I thought in the choice that I made that led to my contract not being picked up, that I was responding from my spirit. But I recognized through the writing process and the therapeutic process of healing that I wasn't responding from my spirit, because my spirit had been depleted because the ego had taken over in the pursuit of being an executive. And so I think that many people who get fired, the ego is the first response. We think, oh my God, what are people going to think? Am I ever going to be able to get a job again? Is everything that I learned going to become obsolete because someone didn't like me or someone chose not to see me? Does it all mean nothing? And that is the ego getting caught up in the action of being fired versus recognizing that being fired has the advantage of showing us what didn't work and pushing us into a direction of what could work. And I want to say, for writers, being fired is absolutely a rite of passage. Like, you are going to have countless situations where your personality may not mesh with the showrunner's personality, where your story skills may not be in alignment with the concept of the show. None of that means that you are a bad person or you are a bad writer. All it means is you weren't a fit for that situation, and that there is something better that is going to be more in alignment with your skills and your personality type that is going to serve you in a stronger way. So it's owning it. Like I have one writer who's a close friend of mine who is at the top of his game and beloved in this town. And he has admitted, I've had him speak at events of mine, and I'll never forget one event where he admitted that he had been fired from almost every job he had ever had. And it was so empowering for me to hear him say this, because what it said to me was, I know I have talent because I wouldn't be here if I didn't. And it doesn't mean that I haven't had struggles along the way. And because I have applied the tools and healed from every one of these, I continue to propel myself forward.
I see so much of why someone does well at an organization, a lot, almost always to do with the culture and are you a fit?
Yes.
It has nothing to do with sometimes the skill set.
Yes.
I see it has to do with, do the rest of the people like the person?
Yes.
Are you in an alignment with the values there? If someone comes from an environment, a family where success is regarded and the title and doing well and where are you this year is so important, how do they handle that? Let's suppose they have to go to a family gathering and they've been fired and they haven't told their family.
Yeah.
And well, so you're in LA, what are you doing? You're all around the dinner table, it's Thanksgiving, whatever. What do you tell that person? Do they tell them? I mean, I guess it's sort of a personal choice.
I think my worldview in life is lead with the why. Lead with, and what I mean by that is the why explains why we want what we want. And the why often involves the wound in the process. And that's how we engage and we find our audience. So if your parents truly believe that, and many parents doubt it, I work with an endless amount of writers who tell me that their parents will give them so much time or their wife will give them so much time to do this pursuit, and then it has to, so I think it's more difficult for those people with the recognition that there's a ticking time clock to be honest when they go through a fall. But I think I encourage those people to engage, because This is what we have to recognize. Now let's talk about Obama's speech the other night, which I personally thought was probably one of the best presidential speeches I've ever heard. And the reason that I connected to it was humility, was the recognition of where he failed. And to me, the message that sends out is the failure should not be what we're looking at. The trying and the attempt to achieve should be what is making us move forward. We should always be taking actions forward. We should always recognize that there are going to be monumental obstacles that are going to get in our way, and we should never let that defeat us.
Do you find, though, people that have come from more of a drill sergeant type upbringing? I've known certain people. I haven't personally had that pressure, but I've known other people that, I mean, their title and what they do is incredibly important to the family. And if they're not that, they almost feel like they can't do anything creative. They've got to have this like label. So have you seen that in some of the writing and some of the people that you've worked with, and how do you kind of ease up on them or not that it's you doing it, but kind of have them ease up on themselves because they have that little thing in them that's driving them?
I would say that the action that a writer can take that does not have familial support or does have people who doubt their pursuit. I would say that the strongest action they can take is bringing that to the page.
Interesting. Okay.
Because that is the hero's journey. That is the recognition that there are going to be internal and external obstacles to where we want to go. And I think everything that builds character in life and in story is our emotional response to what happens to us.
Jen, in your career as a consultant, I understand you've worked with hundreds of writers, many of whom have gone on to be staffed as writers on shows. They've sold pilots. What are you doing that you feel has made the difference to those who's crossed over versus those who haven't? Or maybe there's not one thing, it's sort of based on a full package?
I think it's based on many things. I would say part of what I do with writers is emotionally, I help them to work on what is holding them back. So just as in story, we understand there is a weakness or a flaw that is stopping the hero from achieving the goal. With the writers that I work with, I help them to work on what do they feel internally is holding them back. And very often, I think I can say writers who grasp my story system on structure mixed with they believe that they're going to be a working writer is what leads them to the outcome. So I would say it's, that's the ideal situation. It could be one or the other as well. Like I think story, just like in life, like when I think about everything that I learned through my 17 years of working in the business before I started my own business, and the knocks that I went through during that time, and the ego that was involved in a lot of that, and how through moving through the obstacles and then hitting an all is lost moment really led me to a deeper part of the life process. I think it's the same for writers. And as you mentioned earlier, I also think that writers can be an old soul at an early age due to what happens in their life process. And writers could come into writing at 50 plus and really have something to say and have it really thought out incredibly well. And I think it's through, I'm a definite believer that through the story structure process mixed with the emotional work and the belief in the writing is what leads to the outcome. And part of the work that I do is because, I mean, I've been working in the business 24, 25 years now. So I can tell them where they're at. I can instill belief, which I have to say is probably one of the greatest. There's nothing I love more than reading a script and being able to say to the writer, you are tremendously talented. You have a gift, and this is your calling. And helping them to believe that.
Do you have them do a personal inventory of what they think's holding them back? And if you do, how much of that really matches up for what you see?
I would say our negative narratives are so internally ingrained that I would say it's rare that we can pinpoint it, like certainly in my process. The great thing is now many writers are doing 5 coaching sessions with me. And through the 5 coaching sessions, the great thing for me is I can see things like that. I can see what is holding them back and what they need to work on. Like there are a lot of times where you can have incredibly talented people who don't believe it or don't see it. And so they get in their own way of the outcome happening. So through the coaching process, you are able to help them see, what is working. Like Aaron Spelling taught me, always, always, always start your notes with what works about the story before you dive into what could be better. And I think through doing that with writers, I have come to recognize a lot of my meetings I will do in the way of the first 20 minutes. We'll talk about what's going on in your life right now. How was writing this last week or last couple weeks? How did you feel about what you wrote or rewrote in your script this week? Were there any hurdles that held you back? And why do you think they held you back? And I think through going through the process of what is moving them forward versus what is holding them back, it does help shed light on where they need to focus on.
I know someone mentioned in another interview with you that you have an ability to make people feel safe, and I definitely feel that right now. When you meet with someone who you feel these walls up and it's a lot of ego and hubris and maybe they're not sharing weaknesses, is there a way to kind of get them comfortable? Because some people don't feel okay with weakness. Some people are on the flip side and that's all they know and that's all their narrative is.
Yes.
And then there's others that anything they say, they're always on top. And I've seen that a lot in LA. So how do you sometimes make that person more human?
I think that is a great question. I would say the biggest way I go into that is I give an example. I'll say when I staffed 15 shows and I would meet with writers up to an hour at a time, what I was looking for in that hour is, are they accessible to their own story? They might be able to say, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, but not be vulnerable in the revelation of that process. And a large part of what I was looking for staffing-wise was, is that a well that can be accessed? Or is the ego or is the wall too big to where it isn't something that is penetrable? So I think, and I will talk with writers about this directly. I'll say things like, you need to recognize that your gold as a writer is being able to communicate what you've gone through and recognize that it's almost like you need to detach from your story and not connect shame with it. It's your story. It's what you're drawing from. And I'm going to tell you, executives, the greatest thing they want to know is how big is your well. And the more vulnerability that you show in a meeting with regards to why you'd be the perfect writer to write on this show and have a backup of personal stories that exemplify why you'd be the best writer, that's what will land you a job. So being vulnerable is key in that process.
And the flip side, the one that's just the open wound and it's all gold, but at some point you got to pull it together to kind of get some stuff going. What do you tell that person?
Well, that's the healing process too. Like, I can tell you, I've had 10 friends with cancer. Since my own divorce, I've probably helped 25 people through divorce. And there is, like, when you first go through the divorce or the diagnosis, there is a crazy time that's happening psychologically. An absolute shift has happened in your world, and that shift can cause you to be overly emotional, and yet the gift is be in the over emotion and know that it is going to scale back in time. So I think if I have a writer who's too raw and too in it, I'll say to them, like, maybe now isn't the right time for you to explore this specific thing. Maybe you should take a break from this and write something that is a little removed from the pain that is involved with this story. And I have found that works a lot. And then when they come back to it, they're ready to move through it. Like, say, for example, when I wrote Change Your Story, Change Your Life, it was enough time had passed since I had gone through that loss that I was ready to explore it. And I was ready to be responsible for my own part in the outcome. And I think when you're going through healing and when you're going through trauma, that it's just part of the life process. So I think there's, in my opinion, an advantage to being over emotional, but knowing when you have to scale back and when you have to take a break and then re-explore so that you can utilize that emotion, but come from a stronger place because you've had more time to process it.
Jen, aside from someone taking a break from whatever issues are going on, how can they step outside of their story? Because I think it's so hard when this is the only life we've known and this is our badge and our chip on our shoulder for whatever's happened to us. How do we step outside of our own story for a moment?
Well, I think the gift that writing gives the writer is the ability to go into the fictional world. And when you go into the fictional world, say, for example, you're going to write a TV spec instead of an original. So there is a gift in that because you're moving outside of, I think the biggest mistake writers make is when they write a pilot that is more autobiographical versus just drawing from their emotional truth. And the difference is when you're writing something autobiographical, you're too stuck. You're too in it and you're too like, well, it didn't happen that way, or this didn't happen, or that didn't happen. And I work with writers a lot on that. And I'll say, like, when you look at the movie Nixon and you go, okay, the most pivotal moment in that movie has to do with the drunken phone call. That didn't happen. Yet it was an incredible thing for the movie to have in it because it was dramatic story, and that's what needs to happen. It's really taking the framework of a situation, and then I think the greatest thing writers do is you add your own worldview to what the story is. So I think that when you have a writer that's writing a TV spec, a lot of writers will say, well, I can't use my voice in a TV spec. And yes, you can use your voice. If you identify with one of the characters in a very unique way because of your personal background, then you can escape from your pain and being totally in everything that is and move it into a character that is separate from your world, but use your emotional truth because you identify with that character to drive them action-wise.
So if you look at one of their scripts and you see them as the hero, but they're portraying themselves as the villain, or vice versa, they see themselves as the hero and you see them as anything but that, do you try to guide them another way, or that's just their truth, so that doesn't matter?
Well, it all depends on what is working for the story.
Okay.
You know, I would say, you know, when I look at, as I mentioned, The Night Manager and Happy Valley, like what I noticed in both of those series that I thought was so brilliant were the antagonists were incredible. And so I do think that there's so much we can learn from developing the antagonists, understanding the antagonists, moving with the antagonist. And I think that if writers are seeing themselves in what, I mean, I find that most of the writers I work with tell me they see themselves in almost all of the characters they write. So the good part of that is they're not narrowly looking at one character and saying, okay, this is me. And you can certainly recognize that when they get stuck in something that is so modeled after them, then I think it's not necessarily saying, I know this is modeled after you and therefore you're not doing this. It's saying this character isn't working in this situation because of blank. And it's separating so that they can separate themselves in their story and recognize that you're guiding the story so that it's going to move in a stronger direction.
Can you give us an idea of what a pitch meeting is like? Like in what setting does it typically take place? How long does it typically last?
Well, pitch meetings vary from place to place depending on what is the focus of the pitch meeting. You can have a writer going to a network to pitch a TV pilot, and that could be anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes. And the actual pitch, though, I always tell people to think about the elevator pitch, you know, versus the page pitch versus the 3-page pitch, and really understanding story in all of those parameters so that the situation merits the outcome. Like I've known writers certainly who've gone, and you can have a writer go into a feature meeting and they're going to pitch a feature, and that pitch may be longer. And so I think when I look at the pitch meeting and the pitch process, I think the biggest thing the writer has to be aware of is, number one, they have to be prepared. And by prepared, I mean not only know their pitch backward and forward, know who they're meeting with, know what they've done, know how their story fits in to what their business model is, know their background. And really, when I look at the pitch meeting, I personally look at the first 10 minutes as like being the most important, and utilizing the beginning of the pitch meeting to create warmth so that the pitch can really be heard. and to create common ground. To, if there's something that you love that the person has produced, or something that you love that you're actually there meeting on, share it. Like I always tell writers, you can never stroke egos too much. People always want to hear what they're doing right and what is working and why it's working. So I always think that first warm-up time that people don't really think about is so crucial in the outcome, because number one, it then makes the writer more comfortable. It makes who they're pitching to more comfortable because they feel a connection, and it makes the writer more comfortable because they feel a connection. So then it's moving forward from that, and it's having clarity on what their story is. And I think, like, I have writers pitch to me all the time. I mean, when I was a current executive, every time we had a new episode on the show, as a current executive, my job was working with the executive producers on staffing the show with writers and directors, as well as working with them on from story concept to outline to script to screen. So during that process, that's all we were doing, was hearing pitches, hearing story pitches, what works, what doesn't work, why it doesn't work, what could be stronger, and then seeing notes from those pitches made. And I think a part of my process with writers is I always want them to, when I start a consult that is a script consult, isn't even a pitch consult, but I'll start a script consult and I'll say, pitch me your story. And I always get people, oh, I wasn't prepared for that. Like, I said, this is what I want you to know. You are always going to be pitching your story, so you have to be comfortable with it. I am about the safest person who could be hearing it. So I'm not judging your pitch. I want to hear your story. I want to understand how you see your story. Like, a large part of what I'm looking for in a script consult is what's in the mind and the heart, but isn't hitting the page. And how, through the process of the consult, do we help to unify so the heart and the mind is hitting the page, and so that we're feeling the story that they intended to tell.
Do you ever see writers who are so socially awkward because they can't believe they've made it to see this person, that normally under general circumstances they'd be, hey, I love this show, but because this is their big moment, the nerves get in the way.
Oh yeah.
And all of that goes out the window, and they're more like a sort of a, was it automatron or so, just they're more robotic.
Yes. And the answer to that, like, the answer to nerves, period, is preparation. I think the biggest reason people are nervous is because they're not prepared. And I think when what I tell writers to recognize is, most of the time they're going into a pitch meeting, the person that they're pitching wants it to work as much as they want it to work. No one wants wasted time. Everyone wants it to work. So they're starting the process with someone on their side. And I think as soon as they hear that it helps to alleviate some of the stress. And I said, you also have to remember that the person you're pitching to started at the bottom too. They started with a dream. The only difference between you and them is they're in the process of achieving the dream, and you're also being given the opportunity to start that process. So there really isn't this big divide. It is two people who have the mutual desire to see it work.
Okay, so then let's talk about the self-deprecating pitcher versus the used car salesman, it's all great and I'm fantastic pitch.
I think, like, self-deprecation can work if you have the charisma and charm to pull it off. I think self-deprecation can get in your way if you truly believe what you're saying with regards to the negativity involved. So I think it's versus the ego. I think that, I've heard writers, I think the biggest thing not to say is do not tell them how good your pitch is. And I have seen writers do that. Oh, this is going to be like the best thing you've ever heard, or this is one of the strongest. And there's a difference between confidence and arrogance. And when you have the arrogance, yet the content doesn't meet the level, then it fails.
If you had an opportunity to coach a writer before they sort of even got out of their car and then stepped on the lot, how would you coach them? Like, they have this big interview coming up, you feel like they're prepared, but there's a couple points you're like their coach in the ring before they go and see that receptionist and let them know that they're here for the meeting. What would you tell them?
I think the main thing is the understanding of how to tell and sell your story and how to use the right personal stories that show that you are the perfect writer for the project. I think the current climate in Hollywood right now is all about why are you the perfect writer to be telling this story. And I think some mistakes that writers make is they bring in personal stories, but they're not the right personal stories to deliver the belief and the confidence that only they can tell this story in the way that they can tell it. So I think through coaching writers to recognize what personal stories link them to the concept. And many writers, their personal story doesn't link to the concept, but they may have a personal story that links to the pursuit of the lead character, or that connects thematically with what is being said in the story because of their own personal experience. So it is now, and I also think that many writers go into meetings fearing being too personal.
Interesting.
And I think I'm of the belief you can't be too personal. That's just my belief. I know there are consultants and coaches that believe you can be too personal. I'm of the belief that whatever is driving you to tell story, I want to know and understand. Like I find that the greatest thing, like one thing I'm going to share, I have an event in New York and an event in London coming up. And one thing I want writers to think about in developing characters, I want to give them an exercise. And that exercise is listen to any of your favorite songs and listen to why the words are resonating with you. Then get the album of that artist. Listen to every word in every song that artist has written and sung, and write a character description going into the wound that is driving that character, because that separates them from themselves and it allows them to go into somebody else's journey. And I think whenever you listen to, like, say, Rihanna or Sia or Britney Spears or Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, Adele, like, these are women who understand how to communicate life through songs. And they have had clear moments of despair that have led to some of the best songs out there. So I think writers have the same journey. I always think writers, it's figuring out, how do I take that traumatic life moment and spin it into gold so that it connects with my audience in the way that songs connect with people.
How do you get someone out of the trying to be the perfect student? I don't want to share that. I mean, it's different if Rihanna or Adele, they're who they are, so I can respect their story.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not ready to tell that yet. But you really feel like once that person opens that up and gets that secret out there, that they're really going to be sort of on fire, but you see them, they only want to present this good side of themselves.
I always want the writer to feel safe with what they're revealing, because I think if you reveal too much before you're ready, then you become extremely vulnerable. And the vulnerability may get in your way instead of serving you in a positive way. Like, say for example, I always think there's a way to tell a story. Say for example, I'll give you an example of somebody who I think went a little too far with the personal story was Mackenzie Phillips. Oh. When she revealed the incest with her father. And for me, the timing and the context of it didn't work in the way that it could have worked. And so I can take a writer, I've had writers who've gone through incest, and I've had writers who've gone through rape, and I've had writers who've gone through eating disorders or anything that does contribute to what they have to say, but they don't want to reveal that for fear that it's too much. And I think what I work with those writers on is understand a way to reveal without having to go to any extreme extent that's going to make you uncomfortable or you think the room uncomfortable. So I think there is a way to reveal an emotional truth that doesn't go too far. And yet, in my opinion, again, I encourage to think about the story first. Think about what serves the story. It isn't about, oh my God, this happened to me. It's about, because this happened to me or something similar happened to me and I identify with this, I have something to say.
So how do you know if they're ready? I remember something similar. Someone in a class revealed something very personal, and I could see that the class kind of pounced on this person, and I felt it was unfair, and I saw them years later, and they weren't doing well, and I wanted so much to say something to them, I benefited from your story, but it just wasn't appropriate.
Yes.
So, and that incident was 15 years ago, and I can still see it in my mind.
Remember it. Yeah.
So how do we know that it's too much, too soon? Because I think we all want to really get it all out there. So there's no skeleton.
Well, I had to look at, like when I looked at that Mackenzie Phillips interview, I had to look at why it made me uncomfortable. I had to really understand, why did I not think it was serving in the way that it could? Because it was her pain and it was her story to tell, and there's no judgment on that. It's just, again, I think, what is the motivation and intention behind telling it when you're telling it? So I think that, for the one that you remember, I definitely think that there is a time and a place in that, and understanding, as I say, does it serve the story? Or are you just getting caught up in this life moment?
Sure,
and you know what I mean?
For shock value.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And really understanding, does it serve the story? And does it identify you as the perfect voice to tell this story? And anything less or anything more, you need to pull back from. That's like editing. I mean, when you look at editing is all about, I cannot tell you how many times writers will say, well, Jen, how do I cut back 5 pages? Well, all right, let's take a look at this scene. You go so far into this. What is this scene really about? And you should get in and get out. Who wants what? What's getting in the way? And how do you get in and get out? And anything else is exposition, and you don't need it.
So going back to shock value versus wanting to sort of appear like the perfect whatever, and has done everything right and wants to only present that image to the world. What do you have to say in terms of pitching stories?
I think the main advantage of the personal story, and as I say, like, I definitely feel, understand what is the framework of your personal story. Don't ramble, don't go on. How does, as I say, it serve the story, and what does it say about you as the writer? And be careful not to ramble. And the advantage is this. I remember, and I'm going to tell you, the same goes for me. I had executive producer, Moira Curland, who I have worked with on Medium, and she's been on a gazillion shows. And she said to me, when I'm interviewing 20 to 30 writers in a day for a staffing position, what I remember are the personal stories. So that's your advantage. You could be cautious and inaccessible and not get the job. Or you could understand the right personal story to tell when and make an impact.
And knowing that that's the right personal story and when to tell it, is that something that's refined over time, when
Yes.
you can kind of see somebody wince and be like, ooh, I think I've crossed the line, even though this really is my story?
Yes.
I can tell I've scared them away.
I definitely think there are areas, like when we look at what we talked about, like rape, like incest, like eating disorder. I think that if you think about what is the emotional truth that came out the other side of that, and you frame it in that I went through a trauma that led me to this belief or this negative narrative, or and through that I came up with this idea without having to define what it was that makes you uncomfortable and you fear will make the other person uncomfortable. So I think really what we all want to know is something happened to you that gave you something to say. And how does what that something is serve your story?
Aside from celebrate, what should a screenwriter do once they've finished a script?
That, I had someone ask me this question. It was so good because I said, I'm going to put that into my upcoming seminars, because I think the biggest question of the writer is what's next. And the interesting thing is, and I wrote a first chapter of a book that will be coming out on writing that I'll have posted on my website and everything when it does come out. It is 10 actions a writer can take. So it really goes into this. I think there are a number of things that writers can do once the script is finished. Number one, you want to think about how big is your writing portfolio. So many writers will finish their very first pilot and think that they're going to sell it. And the chances of that are so rare. It has happened. I have seen it happen, but it is so rare. So I think it's having, knowing when it's time for you to take the next step. Very often, the next step of having a script done is write what's next. What are you going to write next, and what does it look like? Say it's the fourth script you've written and your portfolio is now done. So then what do you do next? Then it is writing a creative bio is what I encourage my writers to do. So you can go into, certainly writers who've entered the writing programs like at NBC, ABC, CBS, Warner Brothers, they know what that creative bio looks like, because very often that's the essays that they have to fill out in these writing fellowships. So it is similar to those. A creative bio is like a resume, but it has your voice, and you're telling a story, and you're giving people an opportunity to get a sense of who you are. And so I encourage writers to write a creative bio, then to enter as many competitions as they can. Now this is for the writer who doesn't have a strong contact base. This is for the writer who really is, now for the writer who has a strong contact base, then it is writing a list of everybody and anybody who you think would want to read your script. And what I tell writers is recognize that there's a mutual benefit going on when it comes to asking someone to read your script. If you are asking someone who needs to know strong writers and you believe you're a strong writer, then there's no favor going on. There is a mutual benefit going on. So I cannot tell you how many writers will say to me, I've had writers where I'm like, okay, like you're ready now. You're ready. You've got your portfolio done. You've got, some of them already have an agent and manager. I'd say 50% of the writers I work with have agents and managers already. So now it's moving forward. And the writer needs to operate like an entrepreneur. They need to recognize that even if they have an agent and a manager, they have to go out and make things happen. And it is a partnership that is going on there. So I think once the script is completed, the writer who's newer, I encourage entering as many competitions as possible so that you have reflection. The competitions, if you make it to the quarterfinals or the semifinals or the finals lists, it tells you where your script is. And that is knowledge and information. Like, you don't want to send your script out if it's not ready. Because the biggest mistake writers make, one of them, is sending the script out before it's ready. And granted, I'm going to tell you, every script could go through development forever. It just, that's what it is. But you also have to know when it's in a strong enough place to where it's going to make a strong impression.
Jen, do you have 3 books that you've written?
Yes.
3, okay.
Yeah.
Which chapter of any of those 3 do you get the most comments on, like, this has helped me so much, and why?
Well, it's interesting. I would say the fascinating thing about TV Writing Toolkit, and that's my self-published book. So that's my only self-published book, and it's Jesse Duma at the Writer's Store encouraged me to put like 5 of my workbooks together in a book. And that's what I did. So that's TV Writing Toolkit. And I would say on that book, the comment that I get the most about is people loving how I break down the TV shows to show them how my story system applies to the show. Because that helps really cement the idea of how to use the system in their scripts. Then in storyline, Finding Gold in Your Life Story, I would say just the theme throughout the book of adding fiction to your truth and the recognition that you can use your emotional truth and hide it so that people don't know that it happened to you or it's your story. And I would say that the advantage of storyline Finding Gold in Your Life Story is really helping the writer who wants to move away from the autobiographical but still wants to use their emotional truth in a way that will elevate their writing to a whole new level. And then in Change Your Story, Change Your Life, I would say the biggest comment that I get, and I wouldn't say people come up to me and say, oh, this chapter resonated with me the most. I would say they'll say things like, oh my gosh, like you go so deep into your story and you have so much courage that it makes me not feel afraid to reveal. And for me, that is key. Like the compliment, you know, starting with TV Writing Toolkit, which was my first one, you know, which was really just the basics of all the story events and how you apply story to scripts, then moving into storyline, finding gold in your life story, adding fiction to your truth, so it got more specific in the intent, and then it applied to features and TV, and then moving into change your story, change your life, which is moving toward the entrepreneur, the solopreneur, as well as the writer, in the motivational aspect of how knowing how to tell and sell your story can serve your outcome in a very strong way, and how you can take a negative turn and become the hero in your own story and create the type of life you want to be living.
Are there certain defensive phrases that you see as red flags when a writer gets notes back and you kind of can already tell they're going to go there, and how to coach them so that they don't ruin their relationship with whatever studio is hiring them because of this defensiveness, because of this, well, no, this isn't going to work, and it's just, there's no...
Yes. I would say, like, I'll never forget when I was a studio executive, there was a certain circumstance where this happened, where we had the network, the studio, and the showrunners and the writer on the phone. And the writer was so defensive to the network notes. And it was my job to go to the writer and say, you need to really hear the note, understand the note, and then your best response that isn't going to put somebody on the defense or isolate someone is, I'll take a look at it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That helps to, first of all, it helps, it's positive on the writer. It's saying that they're open. It's not saying they agree with the note, but it's saying they're open to take a look at it. And that's all people want to know. What I think the biggest thing writers have to think about when it comes to receiving notes on their script is, even if they don't agree with the note at face value, they have to understand there might be a note under the note. And the note they need to make to themselves is, something isn't working, and I have to figure out how to make it work. Because if this person who knows story is not getting it, then there's something going on in my process that isn't working. And just be open to that. I mean, the gift with writing, what I say to writers is, you have to recognize, first of all, what is the blank page is the only thing that is between them and a writing career. And how they fill that page is what makes the difference. So they can rewrite anything. Like, that's why I say to writers, I cannot tell you, it was my job, how many showrunners I had to talk off the ledge after they heard notes. And after they heard notes from the studio or the owner of the company, or that I had to be the peacemaker. And I had to really help them to see, all right, at first, I think the writer's mind may go, oh my God, there's a total page one rewrite. Very often it's not. All it is really thinking about the note, understanding the note, and then if they're open to it, what I've seen, the best writer for me knows how to make the note and go beyond the note.
So, oh, sorry.
And that takes openness. You know, that takes advanced ability to really know, all right, well, I'm going to make that note there, and therefore that's going to affect a later moment. So I'm going to change that later moment so that it links with what I just changed. And they know how to do that.
Interesting. So it's not, okay, here you go, I changed this part, there
Yes.
you have it.
Right.
Now what's wrong?
Right.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. What are some of the common defense phrases, like, you know, these are just suits, what do they know? I mean, that's being very crude, but I mean, what are some of the things that really they use as their wall when they receive these notes?
I think probably the biggest wall note is saying, you're wrong. I don't agree. I think that shows lack of openness and accessibility and desire to make the story better. So I think, you know, when writers they'll say, I don't get it. And then the executive or the story consultant will go through it again. And I think, like, this is where I think it comes to the person giving the note. There's also tremendous responsibility. I am definitely a believer that if you're going to give a note, give an example. Show them what you mean so that they understand the note. So, I mean, there are many consultants who will say, I don't think that's my job. I'm not the writer. They're the writer. I am a believer. I come from the studio executive perspective, where clarity is key in the outcome of the story. So if you're going to give a note and give an example of why it's not working or what you mean by it, then you're going to have a stronger chance of getting the outcome that you want.
Jen, I know you have a very busy schedule. You're traveling, you're teaching an upcoming workshop?
Yes.
And you've mentioned it? Yeah.
Yes. I'm teaching in New York on August 12th and 13th with Screenwriters World, and that's Mastering the TV Pilot. And then I am teaching in London, Labor Day weekend for us. That is the London Screenwriting Festival. And I'm doing a masterclass the day before the festival. I'm writing a TV pilot that sells, and then I'm teaching 3 classes at the festival that really all 3 go into, one is finding your voice, the other is the internal story, elevating emotion, and then the last is why the audience returns, having to do with the internal story.
Interesting. I'm fascinated by all of them, but especially the last one. So why the audience returns? Does that mean a series
Yes.
of writing? Let's even take like a Harry Potter or something like that, or you know, Better Call Saul, which is a spinoff of, you know, Breaking Bad. So what is it, do you feel, that is why the audience returns?
I think the biggest why, ironically, is the setting up of the why the character wants what they want. And this is the internal story. Like, when I look at series that should have gone because they had all the components, they had the huge executive producers, they had the right network, they had the right actors, and the story failed. And the reason that I have found on shows that haven't worked, it's the failure to develop the internal story and the season 1 arc of the series. And that has to do with the development of the why of the central character. Because if we don't understand why the character wants what they want, we don't have a rooting interest, and we don't know why we're coming back. And you can look at shows like, if I were to think about all of the television shows that are working, and this could go into features too, but of the TV shows that are currently working, when you look at Blind Spot and you look at The Good Wife, and you look at Homeland, and you look at The Blacklist, and you look at Night Manager, and you go, why is the audience returning? And, you know, a show like The Good Wife, you're going to say, we're not returning to watch the law case each week. The reason why we're returning is because Peter committed a sex scandal that landed him in jail and created the dilemma for Alicia of having to bring security back to her family, leading Alicia to return to a law career that she abandoned 13 years before, adding the complication that her college sweetheart, Will, hires her. So that triangle, and the setup of that triangle on an emotional level, is what brings the audience back. Will Alicia stay loyal to Peter, who betrayed her, and not give in to her connection with Will, who rescued her and who she has a history with? And that question is really what brings us back. When you look at Homeland, you think Carrie, you think, will Carrie remain loyal to the mission, or will she give in to the fact that she feels love for Brody, who she is meant to bring down? That brings us back. That makes us, because it's not a one and out, it's an ongoing dilemma that we can't wait anticipation-wise to see what happens. And that, again, comes down to the powerful question that comes out of the series Trigger and Dilemma. You know, in the case of Homeland, which I think has one of the strongest season arc questions, is Brody the prisoner of war that turned or not? And that's how you set up a concept that leads the audience to want to return, because they have a very big Night Manager. Certainly, you know, there was an incredibly powerful moment of loss that we wanted to understand. Was the character after that loss still going to be able to get what they wanted?
Several ways writers fail to ask for help. Some people suffer from superhero syndrome, could be male or female. They don't want to ask anyone for help. They want to do it themselves. They don't need, no, I've got this. I don't need help. But I know you've said that it's crucial for writers to reach out. How so?
That, to me, is the key between working and not working. Like, you could write the greatest script in the world. If you don't have the courage and the belief to send it out there, nothing will happen. So I think there's actually a book, what is it, Ask and You'll Receive, or just, and I think the idea is, if you don't ask, you will never know. If you don't have a clear goal in mind that you are taking actions toward on a daily, a weekly, a monthly, a yearly basis, then the goal's not going to happen. So I think by moving through the fear, and I think the fear is well-founded if the writing isn't there. If the writing isn't in the strongest place possible, I do believe that when writers are fearful of asking, it's because they know the writing isn't there yet. And so I think it's really trusting that the writing is there, or at least enough of the voice is coming through to make an impact, and trusting and believing in that so that you can take the action with confidence, knowing that you're not going to embarrass yourself, and also knowing the biggest thing about asking is the worst they can say is no. So what? So what? You move on.
Let's suppose a writer is sending out their material.
Right.
But other than that, are there any other things they should be doing to ask for help? whether it's feedback, whether it's taking classes?
I'm definitely of the belief, when I look at my writers that have had the greatest success, it has been a combination of learning. And I am always trying to master how I teach and how different platforms have different outcomes. So whether it's a big event at a screenwriting conference, whether it is an individual class, whether it's a 10-week teleseminar, or whether it's one-on-one consults. It's really recognizing, how do you learn in the strongest way possible? And I talk with writers about that all the time. I've had my greatest success with writers who take my 10-week teleseminar and then do one-on-one consults. And the reason for this is they get the story instruction so that they understand how I see story and what I believe in the system that I've developed that will take them to the next level. And then when they do the one-on-one consults, they have a very strong knowledge of my terminology. And writers who've read my books and then do the one-on-one consults, then you have a stronger opportunity to get the outcome that you want. So I think any story consultant that you're going to work with, I definitely believe, do your research. See the videos that they've produced, read the books that they've written, go to their classes, know their philosophy, and know if it aligns with you and what you want.
How can you tell if a writer is not growing? I mean, a lot of the people that come to you fairly self-aware, or maybe not. Maybe they're really good at writing a story, but the self-awareness isn't there, or maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. There definitely are writers that I work with where the growth isn't happening as quickly as it could. And I think that comes down to the emotional block. That comes down to they're not doing the work. They're hearing the notes. They're loosely taking the notes. They're not going beyond the note. And they're not open to really learn the process. And that really comes down to the writer and why they're motivated and understanding their own why. Like, that's another thing I work with writers on, is what is your why for wanting to be a working writer? And what is the worst that can happen if you don't achieve the goal? And how do you utilize that as fuel so that you will achieve the goal?
Interesting. So the worst absolute thing, they write it down and they kind of work from that point on?
Mm-hmm.
What do you find is the most common reason?
Well, I
the worst
think,
thing?
I'll never forget, like at the beginning of my consulting, probably 7 or 8 years ago, a writer came to me and I understood, and we had worked on a few scripts together, and he was a professor at a major college, and he had a wife and a child, and he said, I need you to tell me the truth. Is this a pipe dream? Should I be spending my time on this, or should I be doing something else? And my response to that was, only you can answer that question. And the fact that you're asking it, you have to think about. And I believe that. I can tell a writer where they're at in the process. I can tell a writer, out of all the scripts I've read, this is where you're at. And they can either utilize that to move forward, or they can fall victim to that. And that's what makes the difference between a writer that succeeds and one that doesn't. The thing writers have to understand more than anything else is everything that happens to them rejection-wise is only going to happen further in their career. So the more they adjust to bouncing off rejection and using it to move forward instead of falling victim to it, the better their chances of success. Like I look at the writer, I'm always looking at, because I worked with countless executive producers, and the thought certainly could be, oh, now that they're at this level and they have an overall deal and they have a show that just got huge ratings and they'll be happy. And what I've found is it's this ongoing hunger and thirst that will never truly be fulfilled. And it's accepting that. And it's utilizing that. And it's knowing that that's what drives the writer. Like, I look at writers in this business constantly who will have great careers and then completely disappear. And you won't hear from them for a long, long time. And many years later, they'll create their own show. And I'll go, okay, they were living life. And now they have more to say. And I want to see what they have to say. So I think it is knowing the life process. I've also had writers come to me who will say, Jen, I can't deal with this lifestyle because I'll work for a year and a half and then I won't work for a year. And then I'll maybe work for a year again and then I won't work for 2 years. Like, what is this? And all I can say to that is you have to always be writing. The working writer's biggest mistake is they stop writing. And when you stop writing because you're on staff for 5 years, so that when you're suddenly not staffed anymore and you don't have 3 new pilots to take out, then you don't have anything to show that what has happened to your writing over that 5 years that you've been on staff.
It almost seems like the very nature of the question, is there something here, is not the question to be asking because it's not driven internally. They're looking for external reward.
Yeah. And that's where, like, you have to look at what is the desire. Is the desire the big house and the parties and everything that you think is the glamorous part of the job? Or is the desire that you are sending your message to the world and making an impact in a positive way? And I think writers have to move into that emotionally. I think a lot of times they're on the outside and they're not ready for the internal desire to really kick in. And I think when life humbles you, then the internal desire awakens and it becomes more clear. And then your writing improves. Like, I have seen writers who have been knocked down again and again, and suddenly it's a certain point that just turns their world and really helps them own what they're sending out to the world. And I think that's the greatest thing in the world when you see that happen. And again, that's the life process happening mixed with the professional process.
So finding meaning in the work rather than the accolades and the perception.
Yep.
Which could eventually lead to a lot of probably isolation and loneliness in some sense, because you have all that, but if it doesn't mean anything.
And that's the key to everything. I mean, the key to everything is when I look at if the motivation is to leave a legacy, and the legacy is to empower the next generation in a strong way through communicating your ups and downs and your lessons that you've learned through this life process, then the chances of when you're hitting it big and everything's there, being fulfilling are much greater. So I've seen both happen. I've definitely seen the executive producer who thinks that, like, I'm going to say many executive producers have been married 3 times, married and divorced, and like that is because they're putting so much energy into the job and not enough into life. And I remember one executive producer who I asked this specific question, who had all that I talked about as far as the overall deal, the hit show, the new marriage, life was working. And I asked the question, are you happy? And the answer was, happiness is such a loaded question. And it was so clear to me that the outcome didn't match the expectation. And so there was more work to be done. And I think there's a value in that, like if you use that in your writing. And I think that that happens a lot. I think that there are writers who hit these massive pinnacles and find that that isn't happiness. And that's why I think the internal work is such an important part of the external outcome.
I've heard the same in music and sports and
everything.
Right.
Everything in life. What is your purpose? What is your calling? Are you in alignment with your internal desire and the external outcome? Or are you limited?
Do you think it comes down to how much personal freedom they feel? Whether it's in their creativity? Because if someone at that level has probably lost a lot of personal freedom in terms of their schedule, in being able to go out, if someone knows what they look like.
And also in the writer's journey, you have to recognize a majority of writers are not writing on the show that they want to be writing on. You know, a majority of writers are taking jobs that they need to take to pay the bills. And that's just what it is. But the gift of that is that's moving you forward to when you can write the show that you create and produce. So that is the show that you want to be writing on. You know, so I think it's keeping the end goal in mind and always using that to motivate your path.
Right. And I use this expression a lot in our videos, but you know, knowing what you don't want is sometimes more than half the battle.
Yes. And it's information. Like, that's what I always say, like getting fired, going back to that. What that tells us is it gives us information. Okay, I was going down a path and I thought the actions I was taking were the right actions, but something shifted or changed. So now I have to redefine a new path and really think about the internal desire versus the external outcome. Do they align? And am I taking the right actions to hit the outcome I want?
In a nutshell, what are some basic storytelling principles for a screenplay? If you had to have a list of bullet points.
I would say for me, it really is the understanding of the wound that drives and the negative narrative that gets in the way, and how the pursuit is one step toward healing the wound. I would say that's definitely one. I would say another story tool that I use is, that also goes into the why, is how does the personal dilemma of the central character link to the professional pursuit? And really being clear on if there's a link, and very often there isn't a link. You're setting up a weakness or a void that isn't connected to the pursuit, and how the pursuit can be the answer to that void. And then I would say having an active hero who has a clear want is definitely a huge thing that I work with writers on, because it's really thinking about, I mean, I think when I first started consulting, one of the biggest questions I asked was, what does the central character want? If I don't know that, the story doesn't work. Like, what I came to recognize when I wrote Storyline, I recognized there were 100 screenwriting books out there. What's going to make my voice different? And at that point, I had been an analyst for 17 years. So I recognized that analyzing was what sets me apart, because I know how to do that. That's what my brain has been trained for. And so I got a bunch of Oscar-nominated, Emmy-nominated, and Golden Globe-nominated scripts, and I extracted a formula, because I thought, I don't want to teach writers how to write a good script, because that won't get them staffed and that won't lead them to sell a script. I want to teach them how to write a script that hits it out of the ballpark. And that formula that I came upon was that every strong story starts with a trigger incident or inciting incident, as many people term it, that pushes the central character into a powerful dilemma. Then the choice that is made in the dilemma is what defines the external goal for the A story. And every obstacle, escalating obstacle, and all is lost moment need to link back to that choice. And when the goal isn't clear, the story doesn't work. Because everything needs to link back to, like, there are countless features as well as TV shows where in the middle of the story, you have no idea what the central character wants. Like, you've lost it, because the actions and obstacles aren't linked to the desire, and we lose a sense of what the desire was. So when you do that, story doesn't work. And very often, writers will write a passive hero that isn't taking action. Another mistake writers will make is they'll choose the wrong lead. They'll develop another character more with regards to backstory and empathy than they will their lead.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they choose the wrong lead.
So if someone's looking at their story, how can they tell they have a passive hero?
Are they taking action toward the goal? It's very easy. Are they reacting to what happens to them? Like many, if you look at act breaks, at the act break, the central character should take an action toward the goal, hit an obstacle, and there should be a reminder of the stakes. That's if the stakes were set up well at the beginning. And the internal and the external stakes should be felt at that act break. But many times the act break is something that happens to the central character rather than it being a result of an action they took toward the goal that led to the obstacle.
How soon should the key desire be revealed within the story?
That's a good question. End of Act 1. We should have a clear sense of what the central character wants by the end of Act 1. Then, now, and I am always studying story and figuring out how to teach in a way that will connect with the writer. So I go off of the brilliant work being produced. And I would say that I've seen the end of Act 1 be on the clear setup of the goal, and that works well. Or I've seen Act 1 end on the first action taken toward the goal and the first obstacle hit. So either of those are fine. I would say in probably most stories, the first action toward the goal is often in Act 2.
Do you tend to see more stories that meander, or ones that it's too explosive, let's wait before we totally get into all this is great, but let's push it down a little bit?
Well, I've definitely seen both lately. I would say there are many new shows that right now in our climate, violence is a scar that we're going through because of what's going on in the world. So violence is not having the impact that perhaps it would at a different time. So I think shows and features are suffering because of that. But I think the lesson that should be learned out of that is that violence should never just be gratuitous. There should always be a reason and an emotion so that it isn't too much, too soon, in your face. You don't want to go through it. So I definitely think that what's going on in the world and what is selling, that there's a link. And I definitely think, certainly shows that were going to air that were violent they've been taken off the schedule because of the violence. So I definitely think that you have the show that does too much too soon and hasn't earned what it explores, and then you have the show that is way too slow, that you're like going, okay. And I really think there is a way. Like I have seen, there's a show that was on, and I don't want to pinpoint, but by a very, very well-known feature producer. And I think the expectation was very high for the show. Very, going into what you said, very slow start that meandered and rambled, but the characters were strong. The concept wavered, but the voice was able to keep your interest for the season. So I think that voice, like certainly when you look at a show where structure may suffer, but voice is clear. I'm going to give you a show that I think has an incredibly strong voice, even though the season structure was extremely strong. I think the episodic structure wasn't as strong as the season structure, but because of the voice and the characters, it kept your interest, and that was transparent. I think that character was, for me, probably one of the strongest characters written on TV. There are a number of characters that I love, but the vulnerability and the openness of that character and the fact that it was based on Jill Soloway's dad and the emotional truth behind that concept and the timing of the concept made everything come into play, and it was masterful. And I look at that and I think that there is a reason when you hit those moments. When I look at Night Manager and I look at Happy Valley, to me, there were creative strides made that were brilliant. And sometimes that involves, certainly when you look at the structure of Happy Valley, that involves going outside traditional structure. And I definitely find that the BBC produced shows are incredible because they go beyond. They push the envelope on traditional structure and they succeed. So I am definitely of the belief that you can, and we see people try it all the time, but I also am of the belief that structure is your friend and structure elevates emotion. So if you're going to go outside the bounds, understand how to keep the emotion within what you're exploring.
Advice for writers coming out of college? What are they? I mean, maybe they've been told, you're amazing, you're going to set the world on fire, you're going to leave our little school, good luck. And they
I would say that my biggest advice to writers coming out of college is live your life. Like, when writers will go straight from college to the writer's room and not experience life, then I find that they are stunted. And so, I mean, for me personally, I like the writer that explores another career path and then comes into the writing and succeeds or fails miserably and has something to say. Like, that, to me, is more interesting than the writer who got straight A's all the way through school and then goes into the writer's room. So I think the biggest thing is understand the journey as well. Understand that it's not about selling that first script. It's about creating longevity, and it's about really taking the time to grow into your own skin, understand who you are, what you have to say, and the impact that you want to make on the world with your writing.
So then, let's suppose maybe they're several years out of college and they finally say, you know, I'm going to block out this much time to write this amazing script. What should I start writing about? Should I do a horror film? Because I know those are popular with the 18 to 34 demographic, and I know I can, you know, add a soundtrack to it. And what do you think?
I would say write about what you're the most passionate about, because it doesn't matter what genre it is. If the passion is there, then that's what will sell. So I would say it's the idea of, you know, it's the idea of really moving through that process and making sure, oh God, I totally lost my frame of thought. Sorry about that. I looked down there.
You start back.
We can start back.
Yeah.
You want me to start? Okay. Suppose a writer is a few years out of college and living life, and they say, well, you know, I have an interesting story about myself here, but then there's this component of my life. Which do you think I should write about? Because which will sell more? You know, I have sort of a coming of age drama, but then there's like this horror type idea I have, then sci-fi.
You have to recognize that the number one thing that sells is passion. And so genre, as much as you can say, well, yes, this genre sells more than that genre, and the timing for this genre might be better. If your passion isn't there, it will show up on the page. And I think if there were an exact science as to what will hit, then writers would be making it all over the place. I think really, like, I'm going to tell you from being a studio executive for the number of years that I was, and still being a writing instructor at NBC, and studying pilots and knowing that, you know, Hollywood doesn't know exactly what's going to hit. Like, they're throwing it out there and praying that Middle America is going to show up. And you can have, you know, I think if you were to survey a bunch of studio executives at the beginning of each season and say, what shows do you think are going to be the breakout hits versus what shows are, there's, you know, it's hit or miss. It is. Like, the shows, like when you take a show like Transparent, I am sure there were so many doubts about that show and would it hit. Yet, you take someone like Jill Soloway, who did 6 Feet Under, and you know that she has a track record, and you know it's based on emotional truth, and you look at the current climate in the world, and everything just happened together. And so, and I think that happens a lot. Like, I definitely think there are shows that the first season like blows people's mind, and so therefore all the expectation is on the second season, and that is a large expectation, you know.
So you've seen that a lot, where the first season is amazing, and then for some reason the second season falls short.
Yes.
And is that because the writing becomes stale? It's not clear?
I believe that that's because the series concept wasn't set up in a strong enough way to understand what season 2, 3, and 4 were. And I've seen shows like, say, for example, Lost. Lost was developed, oddly enough, at Spelling, even though it went to ABC, because the writer Spelling was going to do it with ABC, but then the writer Spelling had, the script didn't come in the way that ABC wanted it, so they got Damon Lindelof and J.J. Abrams, who had overall deals there. Now, Lost, to my understanding, did not have a clear sense of what the show was going to be beyond the first season. And it worked. And that was okay, because the concept was set up in a strong enough way that we cared and we wanted to return. And then the way it evolved each season was mind-blowing, because we were with them. The setup of the series arc was strong enough, even though there wasn't clarity on what the other seasons were going to be, versus other shows where you could feel that they have one really strong season in them, and are they going to be able to keep up with that? And I think the mistake that is made that leads to the show not succeeding is that season 2 goes too far away from the core concept that was set up.
So going back to this writer coming out of college, and they say, I love Lost, and I'm going to write another version of it. But that's not what their story, their own personal story, is anything like.
Right.
And you kind of get to know this person. You find out they had a totally different life from, being on an island is not maybe something that most people have, but, something that's very dissimilar to what they want to write about. What do you say?
I always say the biggest thing to write right now is something that connects to your emotional truth. So if you are dying to write something that has no link to your emotional truth, then think of why you're passionate about the concept. And maybe move for, like I've helped writers think of personal stories that they didn't realize actually did connect to the concept. So I think it's really, I definitely think that there are writers who function better writing about things that are removed from them.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have to think about, like say when you take like Harry Potter, you ground it in thematic emotion, in the idea of, what does ground the concept. And those are themes of, childhood and coming into your own, and things that we all connect with on a massive level. Like when I covered the 4400, I remember thinking, okay, well, not many of us are going to relate with 4400 who are abducted from Earth and then returned back to a life that moved on. But what we identify with is abandonment, redefining your life, the idea of failure to reconnect with a family that has moved on. There are all those things we connect with. So I think when you're writing stories that are outside your emotional truth, it's figuring out how to ground them so that even though the concept may be way outside anything the emotion and the themes are connected to you.
Why writers should educate themselves all the way through their careers? And what are they using as those tools?
I love that you asked that question. So the interesting thing is, I have taught all over the world, and I have found that in countries like Israel, Australia, Toronto, and London, that the type of writers that attend story events and ongoing education are working writers, versus in the US, the story events that are like, the bigger story events that are massive are for usually, I would say, the highest percentage of attendees are writers across the US who had an idea and want to make it happen, versus working writers. And I definitely believe that that holds writers back from creating longevity in their careers. I believe a writer should always be educating. I always say about myself that I'm a teacher for a moment and a student for life. And I am constantly reading every book that comes out on story and emotion and business and anything that can make me move to a higher level spiritually, work-wise, on a personal level. Like, I am all about the idea that we have to constantly, every day I wake up and think about how can I be better than I was yesterday? And for the writer, it really is, how can I expand my knowledge of story through continuous learning, as well as my observance and absorption of life and being able to communicate that in story? How can I continuously do that in a way that will fuel my career?
Do you think it's Western culture and the emphasis on overconfidence a little bit? Whereas maybe other cultures, it's okay to be...
I do. Like, I sit there and I think, I look at these story events that have all the top story people in the business, many of who you've interviewed, and I think, why would you not take the opportunity to continuously learn? I've been in the business 25 years. Like, I have seen every side of the business, and I always think, why would you not take a sounding board? Many of these writers, when you look at Michael Haig and you look at Chris Vogler, and you have had these incredible careers, John Truby and, Eric Edson, and there's so much that they have to say that brings value to the story process, and that's important. So ongoing education, in my view, is the key to creating a writing career that will last.
So just to reiterate, so in the States, you've seen many, maybe what you call baby writers, I think you'd use that term, and it doesn't matter age, it's just in terms of experience.
Right.
But then outside of the States, Europe and beyond, these are working writers,
Oh, yeah.
and they're willing to...
Yeah, I'll ask the question. I always ask the question at the beginning of an event. How many of you have sold a pilot? Or how many of you are currently on staff? And everywhere else, it is mind-blowing to see 2/3 of the room raise their hand, versus here, you maybe see 10 people raise their hand, and it's a very different thing. And I think, I don't know why that is. Like, I sit there, now I can say my personal events, because I've worked with so many working writers, I get writers of all levels show up at those events. But when I do these big story events where there's like 20 or 30 speakers, in my world, I'm like, are you kidding me? That's incredible. Like, I want to get it. I want to soak up. Another one of my favorite story people is Dara Marks. Like, I look at it and I think, I want to soak up like everything they've learned and how they see story and how it aligns with how I see story, because that makes me a better teacher. That makes me like, and I always love seeing like how we coin things in different ways, and it comes from our worldviews and how we teach story. And I think what we're all trying to master is teaching story in a way that leads the writer to sell the story. That's what we all want.
In terms of questions, do you see a difference in the type of question and even the tone that you get in the US-based groups versus, I mean, is there, you know how there's always certain people in a class that want to sort of debate the teacher,
Yeah.
whereas those that have actually a healthy curiosity and they want to know the answer?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, well, one thing I found it's interesting between the audiences, like, I definitely think the US audience absolutely has a curiosity, and I think that people want to learn. I definitely think that in the US we're connected with the idea of the quick fix. So I have an idea, I want to sell it and make it work, and that's definitely a part of it. And whereas I think like the writer in Australia does not make the type of money that the writer in the US makes. Like many Australian writers end up coming here because they don't make the kind of money, but they get the foundation there, and then they come here. And I think that, you know, I think that there is a tone in the questions, definitely from different countries, based on the worldview of how the writer is seen in that country. I mean, we are very fortunate that the writer is seen in a very strong light in the TV world and the film world, even though the TV world, the writer has more power. So I think it causes writers from around the world to want to get their foundation in their own culture and succeed there and then come here. So I definitely think that I've noticed at a number of the events that I've done internationally that the writers who are, I mean, I remember in Australia that I met one writer who had like 4 shows, but was still wanting to come to the US and wanting to expand because they looked at the US as being the end-all be-all because of the pay and because of the way people see writers.
Do you think that film and television writing is open to all sort of class and education level, whereas with the literary world, especially in, like, let's say the East Coast, it's more of a closed network?
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, the literary world, it's interesting. I have worked with several novelists, but not near the amount of novelists as I have with TV and feature writers, because that's my background. But I think I definitely know that story is story, and you're going to benefit and learn from anyone. So I definitely think there are more closed off communities and how they see, but I also think like there's a massive trend right now toward the screenwriter writing the book and then writing the screenplay. So I think that's opening up the idea, and I personally love that process because I love the idea of really deeply going into the internal story in the book and then showing that in visual and action in the adaptation into the screenplay.
So then it creates this whole new viewer, which is the one that read the book first, and they want to weigh it against the novel.
Yeah, and the writer has more power too when they write the book and then sell the film.
Right. I'm thinking of like Janet Fitch. She did White Oleander,
right,
which was a book I had been recommended, but I had never read it, and then I absolutely loved the movie, and now I'm almost afraid to read the book.
Yeah.
But it was just, to me, I'd been recommended.
And that also happens if, are you an internal person? The reason I'm not a screenwriter is because I'm an internal writer, and I know that about myself, you know?
Going back to self-awareness.
Yes.
Right.